Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. It's lovely to see so many of you, especially on a nice day. I'm sure had this been 2 weeks ago, then I might not be here. But it's lovely to have you all. It's the start of a new museum lecture series focused on Neanderthals because it's a very special year for us. If you haven't heard already, the skull of the Neanderthal child, the second Gibraltar skull, was found in 1926, so it is a centenary year. And we'll be doing a number of things, which culminating with a large international conference in September that we'll be announcing more, where we already have committed most of the leading specialists in the field coming out to Gibraltar. And that'll be from the 1st to the 6th of September. Now, theming Neanderthals, and others will be talking about the different aspects of Neanderthals and the work that has been done, particularly in Gibraltar over the last over 30 years now. I felt that this particularly it's a public lecture to give it a slightly different angle. Maybe some of the things those of you who've come may have heard before, but there will be new things. And one of the things I wanted to make it quite visual. So one of the things, and that's why we have the acknowledgements at the bottom, all the photographs you will see are taken by us, Geraldine, Stuart or me, as part of a longer term project we've been doing, where we are studying the behavior and photographing at the same time of the different species that we record in the fossil record alongside Neanderthals. We can't photograph the Neanderthals themselves, but most of the other species are still around somewhere in the planet. That might take us maybe to Africa, or might take us up to the high Arctic, but somewhere you'll find them. And understanding their behavior helps you to understand how the whole community works. And that a lot of it is what I'm going to be talking to you about today, is that broader ecology. You know, how do we fit the Neanderthal, a human after all, within that context? So that's the subject of that. So the photography you will see is all ours, but I also want to acknowledge world-famous paleo artist Maurice Anton, who has worked with us and is working with us actually on a new project now for this year, but you won't see those images, but certainly reconstructions such as that one done by him based on information that we've given him about Gorham's cave and so on, and he's done some of these wonderful images for us. So if we cannot actually photograph them, at least we can begin to imagine what they were like. But in all cases, we've worked very closely, and it's not just our imagination going to run, it is based on real material that we found. So here, for example, and I'll move on straight away from here, but you have a group of Neanderthals. This is inside Gorham's cave. Those of you who've been there will recognize it from the inside. They're doing this famous hashtag engraving there. Great auks, which are now the only one of the few species that are now extinct along with Neanderthals. Great auks are hanging there from the side. They're going to be eaten later. Fire, which is a very important aspect in terms of understanding Neanderthals and their behavior. They control fire. And our friends, the hyenas, in the background trying to get in to see what they can get. So in many ways, that introductory slide paints literally a picture, which is the one I'm going to be talking to you about today. Let's introduce the subjects of the talk, the Neanderthals themselves, and this is, on the top there is a reconstruction of the 1926 skull was found in fragments, not complete, but with a team of colleagues in Zurich, computer tomography, we were able to reconstruct the entire skull. This was done in the 90s, it was quite groundbreaking, and actually that image made the cover of the journal Nature in its day. So that's quite significant. Since then, working with artists, I guess we could call them the Kennis brothers from Holland, we commissioned a reconstruction, a forensic reconstruction of what they would have looked like, based on the skulls, based on the metrics. And a lot of this has been confirmed by genetic work. We've now been able to extract fossil DNA from these two, and we have some ideas to things like eye color and so on. There's a bit of poetic license there. Was the hair long and so on? But by and large, that is the Gibraltar II skull, as it came to be known, and more popularly today, the child is known as Flint, which was a play on the idea with flint is the material that would be used for making stone tools. But Flint, believe it or not, Captain Edmund Flint was the discoverer of the first skull. So the kid had to be called Flint. And we know he was 4 years old. Okay, so the 4-year-old Flint is who we're celebrating. But Neanderthals lived across Eurasia. We don't have any evidence today of Neanderthals in Africa. And they formed a population that living in Gibraltar here, they were in the far west. This was the far west. But they reached certainly into Central Asia and possibly, quite possibly into China and Mongolia. There's some uncertainty there. But a Eurasian population, subspecies if you like, I'm certainly giving them a subspecific name. I don't think that they could be considered species in their own right. And populations that when our own ancestors, but they were our ancestors as well, but when they interacted, when those populations came out of Africa in Eurasia, they interacted and exchanged genes. So things are not as clear-cut as they were in the past, and certainly, although my talk is not about their behavioral capacities, I think some of the others will be talking to you about that in future lectures. Mine is more about ecology, but certainly one of the things that we've been able to show in Gibraltar is by and large that these people were human, very intelligent, survived for a long time, survived on the planet longer than we have been around, and did very well until one day they went extinct. But that's not the subject necessarily of what I'm going to talk to you about today. I want to paint a broader picture of, you know, Flint's life. When Flint was around, what did he see? What did he not see? What did he interact with? What was positive for him? What were the dangers? And so on. The other actor in the play is the hyena, the spotted hyena. Now, the spotted hyena is the same species that you find in East Africa today, the one that goes around in large groups. You've got other species of hyena, but the Latin name is Crocuta crocuta. The spotted hyenas in Gibraltar would have been the same species, but significantly larger. A lot of the animals in the Pleistocene were quite larger than today. And so these would have been formidable creatures roaming around, and you'll see where they were roaming around in a moment. But the spotted hyena actually had a broad Eurasian distribution, more or less matching that of the Neanderthals. They never went north, they never crossed the Bering into North America, but they were spread right across Eurasia. So the spotted hyena, if you want to give it a subspecies name, the paleontologists call it Crocuta crocuta spelaea, the cave hyena. But in essence, it's a king-size spotted hyena of the kinds that you would see in Africa today. So these are the two actors in the play, although other actors will appear as well. Context: scavengers or hunters. And I've put that, this is another one of Maurice Anton's images, and this is again based on what information we've provided. These are the sand slopes on the eastern side of the rock, and essentially a group of Neanderthals are trying to wrestle the prey of a leopard. It's an ibex. Notice again we're playing with ideas. At the back you have a colony of northern gannets, as you might have on Bempton Cliffs today, or I've heard somebody mention in Bempton, or Noss in Shetland. And we have pretty good evidence that these birds during the glaciations were further down and were breeding in colonies around here. That's an aside. You'll get a lot of asides from me. But the question here, which is, I mean, it's still there, but it was a hot debate for a long time, was whether these humans and other humans were hunters or scavengers. I never really saw the problem with being both. Which is the way I see it today. Intelligent, opportunistic people who are not going to look down, turn their nose up at the possibility of a fresh carcass or chasing some animals, a leopard away and taking it if they have the possibility. And these are notions that we've sort of formed in our own minds about what is the honourable thing to do or the right thing and so on. And, you know, it has no bearing on the way people behaved in the past. So to introduce scavengers or hunters, and I'll come back to them later, certainly from my point of view, Neanderthals and we're seeing a lot of other evidence as well, were not only hunters or scavengers, they were also foragers and gatherers. They did a bit of everything. And this whole notion of the tough Neanderthal who only caught large mammals by wrestling with them is absolute nonsense. Most of the time they were omnivores, they were eating plants, they were eating small kinds of animals. They were subsisting on what was there. And if you just to add to the point, I don't know if those slides are a bit, no, you can see them fine from there. The archetypal scavenger in people's minds, the spotted hyena, is actually also a hunter. There's a hyena there, being a bit brave with those Cape buffaloes there, but there is a little one there. You see the young calf? And so they will, especially at night, they will hunt. So in the same way that the archetypal Neanderthal hunter, I'm sure, was a scavenger, your archetypal scavenger is also a hunter, and this is a question about opportunity. It had nothing to do really with cognitive abilities or intelligence or anything else. It's about being opportunistic and being able to cope with situations. And that is, I think, what made hyenas, as well as Neanderthals, successful over large areas of the planet for a long time. The only reason that hyenas are now left in Africa is probably because it's where we've allowed them to be. But, you know, I do not consider the spotted hyena to be an African animal necessarily. It's only where they're left. But that's, again, another story. What about the caves themselves? The caves where we work, particularly the two which are part of the World Heritage Complex, which is the whole of that wonderful cliff face. On the left you have Gorham's Cave. On the right here you have Vanguard Cave and a series of other caves along here. They have a unique record recognized by UNESCO as being of World Heritage importance. Sequences that go from 125, 130,000 years ago, almost to the present, with fairly continuous occupation by people, Neanderthals particularly, from that very beginning until around 32, 34,000 years ago. And after that, other humans, our ancestors, if you like, come in. So when I talk to you about the species that we find in the caves, it's the species that we're finding in those deposits inside the caves. And you'll make sense of that in a moment with my next picture, but essentially those deposits in the caves were formed by winds blowing sands in and organic matter coming in from the caves themselves, all mixing up, and people living in there, Neanderthals, people's rubbish being left behind in their campfires and so on. But of course you can say, well, how is all that sand being blown in? Look, the sea is right up to here. But for the greater part of the time that Neanderthals were around, the global climate was significantly cooler than it is now, which meant that global sea levels dropped by as much as 120 meters globally at some points, not all the time, which means that the coast was further out. And one of Mauricio's images will tell you paint the picture very well. Here's a Neanderthal pretending that he can fly like a vulture. But look, what you have outside, and Gorham's would be below, is a huge sandy plain, which at its height would have been 4.5 kilometers away from the present coastline. It would have fluctuated. And you have a system of sand dunes with the vegetation. I'll talk about the vegetation, how we know what the vegetation was like. You have a series of lakes, seasonal lakes, and we know that there were lakes because of two things. We have a lot of aquatic animals being brought into the caves, and as Geraldine might tell you in her talk, I'm not sure what she's going to talk about, but I'll tell you now anyway. About a kilometer out, if you go out now a kilometer out and you dive 30 meters down more or less, 35 meters down, coming out of the surface of the seabed and bubbles and is fresh water. Now, if you take the volume of sea out, that fresh water becomes shallow lakes. Now, why is that? The reason is that here, Gibraltar ends. In other words, the limestone of Gibraltar finishes there. And from there on, the geology is sandstone. Now, the limestone is porous. All the rains that have been happening now, coming through, forming caves, eventually come underground, under the seabed, and end up here. And they start bubbling up when they hit non-porous rocks. That is today. So in the past, these underground rivers and river systems would have generated these shallow lakes, which means that these people not only had, as you will see now, different sources of places where to hunt and forage and eat, but they also had something very vital in this part of the world, or anywhere for humans, and that is a supply of fresh water. So when we talk now about hyenas and Neanderthals and other animals, understand that landscape of Gibraltar, because to understand it the way it looks like today, it makes no sense. One of the things we've been doing is, over the years, is looking for landscapes that might still exist that resemble those that were outside Gibraltar. Finding species that live in those landscapes, understanding that some may have gone now. In Europe there are no hyenas, for example, and then trying to use them as proxies to understand what was going on, what was living there, and what could have happened. I'll be talking to you about this for a chunk of my talk, and then I'll move on to other aspects that I want to cover. And the best proxy, with a match of almost accepting some of those species that are now extinct, but almost matching 100% the birds, the vegetation, and so on, are the sand dune areas of the habitats around the National Park of Doñana, which is about 130 kilometers from here. And they are, if you go there and you go and do that, and you see the deer and the wild boar, imagine that that is what was outside Gibraltar. Because they don't have Neanderthals either. But it's been a very good proxy for us, and we've used it. We've worked there for many, many years, getting detailed information about that, and I'll be talking to you a little bit more about it in a moment. And it's a landscape which is dominated by sand dunes. You can see there, you can just see about in the background there, some woodland. Here you have stone pine woodland. The stone pine, which is a Mediterranean pine, is a very abundant plant outside Gorham's cave throughout. It's probably the most abundant tree. One of the reasons is, of course, it's a very good stabilizer of sand soil. It grows fast, and it's a good stabilizer of the dunes. More of that in a moment. But the other aspect of this, of course, with dunes is you have sand and soft areas where you can burrow. Now, hyenas, as you can see there in East Africa, they will burrow into the ground. They have their dens in the ground. And the substrate of sand dunes would have been very useful for them. But of course, you might not have in the Serengeti is what you do have in Gibraltar. You would have had those sand dunes and those landscapes out there, but you had caves. And it's too much of a temptation for a hyena not to come into a cave and have a den on a sandy substrate inside a cave. This view is from a small shelter outside Vanguard Cave, looking outside, where we found some time ago now evidence that the spotted hyenas have been denning there. They've been having the young there. And imaginatively, as we all are, we called it the hyena den. But they were in there, you know, and this is one of the wonderful things about these sites. You go into Gorham's or Vanguard, and you step there and you stand there, and you realize, you know, once upon a time hyenas were roaming here, and it takes a bit of a leap to assimilate that. So, although we know that Neanderthals were living in these caves, we now know that hyenas were also living in those caves. The question is who was doing what and when. Now, one of the things that's very clear about the Neanderthal occupation of these sites is that it was sporadic. I think Neanderthals were not living in Gorham's cave all the time. If they had been doing that, the cave would be full of their rubbish and materials and stone tools. It is not like that. So they were wandering onto that outside landscape, moving around, probably returning from time to time, or probably when they needed shelter and protection. So maybe there's a toing and froing there between hyenas and Neanderthals. Some other aspect on hyenas. Hyenas are very aggressive and powerful animals, and the bite of the jaw is quite incredible. There's a nice picture there that Stuart took. But just to illustrate, on the top there, beautifully preserved, is a mandible of a spotted hyena from Gorham's cave. It's almost intact. In fact, I suggest if you look at the mandible and you look at the architecture of the mandible, then the teeth, it's almost a perfect match, isn't it? Well, that's dates of that is approximately 60, 70,000 years ago. So it just gives you an idea, and it's a Vanguard cave, not Gorham's cave, sorry. Gives you an idea of the beautiful preservation of material in these caves. The incisor is a human incisor. And this is from a few years ago from Vanguard Cave. It's the incisor of a Neanderthal. And it's, again, it belongs to a child, again around 4. It has still the root, but it's fallen. In other words, with the root. That would not be, it's not shed, it's not been shed. It's fallen with the root. That should not normally happen. And it was in a part of Vanguard Cave, and we've looked and we haven't found other evidence. The only bit of Neanderthal evidence is this hard, tough tooth in a part of Vanguard Cave where we knew at that time, and we're looking at 50,000 years ago, that area of the cave was not occupied by Neanderthals. There were no stone tools, there was no fire. So what was the tooth of a 4-year-old child doing there? Well, what we do know is that hyenas were denning there. So one strong chance is that the hyenas had the kid. Either scavenged it or killed it. We don't know. But it gives you once again a picture of, because we tend to present an idyllic picture of a wonderful landscape, lots of food, lots of water, but it was also a very dangerous place to live. And caves were important in buffering. So those are the hyenas inside the caves, but what about the Neanderthals inside the caves? Well, this is just one example. This is a layer that was dated at 47,000 years ago. And what you see there, you can just see the mandible at the top and some other bones, a couple of incisors down here, some stone tools. This is inside Gorham's cave, and the Neanderthals had butchered an ibex, a wild goat, which they proceeded to consume. You can see some of the mandible particularly has a lot of evidence of burning. They created a hearth inside the cave, they hunted the ibex, and they feasted. Now we wonder what the hyenas would have been doing then, probably looking from the outside, wondering, when am I going to get a chance? And they did get a chance, but it must have happened once the Neanderthals had gone. Because in that same position, and above and therefore afterwards, we find this. And what is that? Well, let me just highlight those. Those are coprolites, fossil poo. So the hyenas went in there, and they ate or whatever, and they pooed. They didn't die there, we don't find their remains, but we know they went in there and scavenged. Now, why is that interesting? Well, it tells us that the hyenas went in there, but there's another element of this which I think will interest you. Some of you may have heard me talking about this before, or Geraldine or Stuart, so forgive me, but I want to present you with a complete picture. One of the things we find, there's somebody holding a large hyena coprolite, is that when you get those coprolites, and some of those, like I said, that was 47,000 years ago, they could be older. The reason they preserve very well is the hyenas crush bone and have a lot of calcium, and that allows that feces to form in a very solid manner and preserve through time. But one of the things that you find is if you begin to look at the coprolites under the microscope, and that could be a coprolite, when you can extract pollen. Now, you would say, well, what's a carnivore doing with pollen? Well, the carnivore eats the intestine of a herbivore. The herbivore's been eating plant material, and the hyena ingests that pollen. tens of thousands of years later, those pollen grains are still there, waiting for us to come and find them, which is quite remarkable. And what that then allows us is to reconstruct what that landscape would have been like, because we know then, we do a list, I'm not going to go into detail, the list of all the different plants that are found in those coprolites. So we have two sources of material that allow us to understand what the landscape was like from the vegetation point of view. The hyenas, if you like, are giving us a sample of the landscape of the broad range. They're moving around, eating things in different parts. They're giving us a sample from the pollen. But if you want something which is more immediate to the area surrounding the cave, well, we can do that too, because what we find is the campfires, the hearths of the Neanderthals. We get the charcoal, we can look at those, the cellular structure under the microscope, and we can identify the woody plants that went into the barbecue or the campfire. Now, nobody's going to go 5 miles down the road to get a tree to start a fire. They would have collected it from near the cave. So the charcoal gives us a pretty good idea of what the landscape was like immediately outside the cave. The hyenas give us a sample of the larger landscape. And thanks to Mauricio giving us a nice representation. I hope you can see that well. So this is what that coastal shelf looked like. And I've already alluded to the proxy of Doñana. And what we tried to portray here were a number of things. You have the shallow lakes. You have the woodland of stone pines. You have the dunes going up to the rock. The caves would have been at the back there somewhere. And we're being a bit provocative here. You have a herd of deer and some aurochs, which are the ancestor of the wild cattle, these large bulls. And vultures feeding on the carcass of the deer. And there's a golden eagle coming in there. And there's also 2 azure-winged magpies. I'll leave the azure-winged magpies for a moment. And what we were playing with here is not only were Neanderthals hunting, but the idea that they were putting out carcasses to attract birds, which they would then catch for their feathers and talons. And they were doing that particularly with golden eagles. So that's what we tried to portray there. But it also portrays what the landscape would have been like. And if we needed to, and we published a lot on this, we could give you a whole list of species, of plants, and so on. One of the things that I would say is that throughout, most of the time Neanderthals were here, even though you are looking at times when global climate was colder than today, leading towards the ice ages, the landscapes here were very similar to what you would expect today. Very much Mediterranean climate. The area seemed to have been buffered from the harshness of the north. So when, for example, Britain was under 1 kilometer of ice, olive trees were still growing here. And that adds to the refuge effect, the refuge idea of why Neanderthals and a lot of other species survived here and then recolonized Europe from this part of the world. This really was a climatic refuge. Now, another thing that's interesting, at least to us, is the structure of the habitat. One thing is to talk about the different species of plants, but what does the habitat look like? By structure, I mean, imagine trees, shrubs, grasses as objects in a three-dimensional space, and they're arranged in particular ways. So some places may have a lot of trees together, others scattered and so on. That structure of that habitat gives us a lot of understanding as to the behavior of people and the behavior of hyenas and others. Let me show you what I mean. Let me start with these bones. These are distal humeri, wing bones, of a bird that we call the Iberian magpie. Now, this is an aside. Do I have time? Well, you're going to get it anyway. The Iberian magpie has a very peculiar distribution. You find it in this part of the world, not in Gibraltar today, there's no landscape for them. In this part of the world, from here towards Portugal, and then you have to go to China, Korea, and Japan to see them again. There's nothing in between. And people thought that the reason for this was these are colorful birds. The navigators, the mariners of the Middle Ages, Portuguese particularly, brought these colorful birds back. They escaped and colonized the southwest of the Iberian Peninsula, which was fine until we found those bones dating back to 40,000 years ago. And I'm going to tell you a little secret. We have just now found another bone of a Zewing magpie, not 40,000, 100,000.
Wow.
So they've been around for a very, very long time. So what that's telling us, and it's a different story, I accept, is that once upon a time, these magpies were right across Eurasia, and the climate changes, the lifting of Tibet, the plateaus, the desertification of the Central Asian areas into deserts and steppe, the habitat of the magpie disappeared, and it stayed in the two corners. What was the habitat of the magpie? How can that help us? And we've done that with a lot of different kinds of birds. Well, I'll tell you what we can do. Because in addition to knowing that, the logic is this: we know that magpies are there, we've got their bones. We know the magpies out there today. So let's go out there and see what they're doing. And assuming that there's been no significant change in their ecology, their morphology is the same, that can tell us something about the landscape. Let me give you the example. This graph. When you look at territories of these magpies today, and this is the tree density, in other words, how many trees per hectare, from 0, no trees, to 60, which would be dense forests, you can see more or less that their distribution has a particular pattern. And it's like an area with some trees. Trees are necessary, but dense forest is not there. Now, when we then add that up with other species of birds, we can begin to tell a picture. So not only do we now know that stone pines are there, we can begin to predict what kind of density it is. Was it dense forest outside Gorham's cave? Was it an open plain? Or was it something like this? We've done that for other species. I don't want to take too long over this, but these are different species of birds, and if you look at it, once again, the bottom would be open, the top would be forest. You can see they're in some in-between area. Once again there, and there. I don't want to bore you with this, but this, perhaps the picture tells the story better than I can. This is what we found is the essence of the human habitat through time, not just applicable to Neanderthals, but applicable to humans in different parts. And it's that structure. That's Doñana, this is Serengeti. The plants are totally different, but the arrangement in space is very similar. And this is what people liked. People liked it for a variety of reasons. It has a lot of rich resources, but it's got cover, you can ambush. There's a whole range of reasons. So what I like about this, and I can take you to Australia and show you there similar landscapes where people were living in. What I like about this is the universality of that requirement. And there's some fantastic work's been done to show that this is a basic component of the human niche. But I have added the hyena habitat as well. What else can I tell you? Right. We have, one of the things that characterize Gibraltar is a patchwork at small scales of different habitats. And looking at the different species, we can identify a whole range of them. You had the stone pine woodland that I've already talked to you about. You had evergreen woodland with cork oak trees, for example. You had the matorrals, the scrub, meadows and prairies, cliffs, still there, caves, still there, other rocky habitats, lakes, we've seen. There were rivers flowing through. There's one particular estuary where the airfield is now, the river estuary there. Estuaries, freshwater marsh, saltwater marsh, the coast, and the sea. This is a wonderful diversity in a small area of opportunities for a predator or a hunter. Now, what about the habitat dynamics? I'll spend a little bit on this and then move on to other things. In other words, is that habitat static or does it change? Does it move around in time? Now, the best example is Doñana. And I'll show this to you as a historical record, of what happens in Doñana with the dunes. The dunes are constantly moving the habitat around. So people have to move around with that. So in Doñana you'd have the dunes engulfing the stone pine woodlands into these corrals, gradually isolating the trees, just killing them as they move, but then the pines start growing somewhere else. This is the top the crown of a pine tree has been completely killed off and engulfed by the dune. This is happening all the time. So these people out there had to deal with this, had to live with this constantly changing environment. You can see there that pine tree. It's been left there on the dune. Why have I put that picture? Can anybody offer me? If you've heard it before, don't say it. But no? Can anybody suggest what that is? No? It's a well. Okay? And that's in historical times. It was 50, 100 years. Somebody dug a well into the dune, got water, the dune moved. For me, that's the best illustration of the dynamics at small timescales of a system such as this. That's in Doñana as well. We looked at other aspects. That's Stuart there many years ago with us in Doñana. And we tried to look at the distribution of, through time, of different habits. One of the things we did was, I'll show you here, don't worry too much about this. 1 to 21, we did a transit inside Doñana. We would go every month and for 4 years. Along sand dunes and tracks off-road. And these transit points are a kilometre apart. And these are the kinds of grasses, low, medium, high, which have their own quantification, shrubs and trees. So what you can see is, on that transit, there are some areas with a lot of shrubs, some areas with trees of different heights, never tall trees. So the landscape is a patchwork. This is something different now. This is the same transit through time over a period of 3 years. And like now, we had 2 years of drought and 1 year of a lot of rain. Just like this year here. And the colors show you where the standing water was. So you can see that along that transit there were areas that would always hold water. And when it really rained, they became huge lakes. And then some areas which didn't have water, but when it rained, also had. So once again, it shows you the diversity of opportunities that people or any predator or any animal would have had, and how that is so different from one year to the other. That reminds me, the rate of change reminds me of a study that was done with pollen in Italy, in Neanderthal times. And what they saw there, that the world of the Neanderthal was changing from open treeless steppe to dense woodland and back as climate changed. Imagine, a habitat with no trees, a habitat where you can't see your way through because there are so many trees, and it's going backwards and forward. But the stunning thing was that the average rate of change from one to the other was 142 years. Which means that potentially a Neanderthal born in an open steppe, the grandchild would have been born in a forest. Those are the timescales of speed of change. And this is just grass cover showing the same thing. I'll move on. Right, one of the things that we saw when looking at different species, at the bottom we have the transit and time. Species like grey-lag geese were always in certain areas of the transit, but in fact, curiously, towards the top, when it rained a lot, they disappeared. The place got flooded. So this is a potential prey species. You know where if you're a hunter, you know where you can go. You go to those areas over there. But there may be some years when you don't do very well because they're not there at all. Something like quail, a migratory bird, was absent. And a migratory bird that we know Neanderthals were catching was absent. But on the wet year, with all the grass, look, they were right across the habitat. So from one year to the next, that prey had gone. Something like a red-legged partridge was resident, was there all the time. But again, peaks, it wasn't uniformly distributed in the habitat. And finally, red deer, the same. Not always uniform. Geraldine gave a great lecture just before Christmas. So I'm only going to put this here now. But one of the things we've been working now, one of the things you see, this is Doñana in an early morning before anybody's gone there in the reserve. And you see the footprints of all the animals that have been there the day before. One of the things we're finding now, including in Gibraltar, are fossil footprints. And that's giving us an amazing picture. We have, going back 140,000 years ago, a footprint of a Neanderthal on the sand slopes above Catalan Bay, which we published. But alongside are the footprints of leopards and all these other animals that I've been talking to. So now the footprints, and we're working here we're working in Cape Trafalgar, we're working in Mata las Cañas by Doñana, all the way to Portugal, and we're finding evidence of elephants, all kinds of species roaming around, and of Neanderthals going and tracking them and hunting them. There are cases, there's one case in Portugal, side we look in Portugal, where you have the footprints of a deer and the Neanderthal footprints right above, so there was a chase on. And another interesting thing that we've found from that site is that there's one area where they're hunting deer, but surprisingly, when you look at the footprints, you can work out their stature. There were adults there, but there was a 9-year-old and there was a 2-year-old toddler participating or running behind in the hunt, learning from a young age. Something else. So all this allows us to look at what habitats like this in Doñana or outside Gibraltar should be like without our interference. So of course you have the imperial eagle, of course you have the lynx, but really you ought to have leopards and hyenas. I'm not suggesting that we should reintroduce them. But that is what the baseline of that environment is. So you can begin to see how impoverished the world that we look at is. Let me talk to you about some other things now, which I think, yeah, I've got time. The rabbit. Well, the rabbit is an endemic of the Iberian Peninsula. Wherever else you see it, it's introduced. And the rabbit has attracted, it's a very good prey, and species which have become totally specialized on the rabbit. One of them is the Iberian lynx, which we find in the caves of Gibraltar as well. We find lots of rabbits, and we know the Neanderthals are eating rabbits. But the Iberian lynx is an almost 100% specialized predator of the rabbit. It's a species that is separated from the other lynxes. And here you have an Iberian lynx with that stone pine woodland today, as it would have been outside Gibraltar. And you may not find this very tasteful, but I'm sorry, they are night hunters. And in fact, Stuart, with a similar shot from that, just got an award last month from the British Ecological Society. This is a lynx. The rabbit, I'm sorry, is still alive. It's been killed by the lynx. Okay? Maybe the Neanderthals saw that. But the Spanish imperial eagle, another endemic, there's an imperial eagle across Eastern Europe and Asia. The Spanish one, species, is a specialist on rabbit as well. But let's not forget that Neanderthals were eating a lot of rabbit, which breaks the mold of the idea that Neanderthals were always catching mammoths and elephants and all the big things. When they caught a large animal, they had a big feast and celebrated. It was once in a blue moon. They were eating rabbits. So they were eating it with these things. And the Bonelli's eagle is another eagle which is spread across the Mediterranean, not so restricted to rabbit, but will eat rabbit. And the golden eagle, the biggest of the species, and here are some remains of golden eagle from the caves. You can see a bill, some talons, and so on. The golden eagle will also go for rabbit. So here's one relationship that would have been happening outside Gorham's cave with all these species. Always with the Neanderthals in the backdrop. I'll summarize it at the end. The red-legged partridge and many other birds were taken by Neanderthals. They were supposed not to, but we found evidence of that, pigeons and so on. And a lot of these smaller predators, foxes, goshawks, would have also taken them. Again, when I show you these images, they are species that I can verify were outside Gorham's cave from the fossil material. I'm not making it up. And I'm just selecting a few, because if I had to put all 161 species of birds that we found, we'd be here all night. I mean, that's a third of the avifauna of Europe, which gives you an idea of the richness of the environments. The ibex, of the larger mammals, the ibex appears most frequently, possibly because it was most frequently hunted by the Neanderthals, and there was a bias in what gets brought into the cave. You saw the picture before of the ibex that had been butchered. But it's a large animal, a lot of kilograms of meat, and relatively safe to hunt. And the other one is the red deer. These are the two principal components of the habitat, at least in terms of what is hunted. There are other things as well. So why am I showing you this? Because that is what attracted other species that lived outside Gorham's cave alongside the Neanderthals. There were leopards. The lynxes are specializing on the rabbit, but the leopards would have gone for these. Yes, there were lions. Imagine a situation if we could go somewhere in the world and we had leopards, lions, and wolves. I don't think there's anywhere in the planet where you can see them now. There were wolves outside the cave. And there were brown bears. I love this shot. We took it in Finland on the Russian border with the cubs, and it's one that I particularly like. I don't think there's anywhere in the world today where you can get that confrontation. But it happened in Gibraltar. And you know what? I think the wolves won. They didn't necessarily win on a one-to-one conflict. But if you look at the broader history of hyenids and earlier species across Eurasia, their decline starts when dogs begin to arrive, canids from North America into Eurasia. And I think the adaptability of the wolf is probably what won the day. And a lot of the decline of the hyenas in Eurasia may well have had to do with the success of wolves. This is a conjecture up to a point, but I think that there's a lot of mileage in that. Now, scavengers. Let's go back to scavengers. Remember, let's not just talk about hunters. What about the scavengers? Hyenas we talked about. I like showing gory pictures. You're going to see some more. But when you look at the list from Gorham's, we have a lot, up to 29 different species that in one form or another would have been scavengers. So you have griffon vultures. These species that we found there, black and red kite, some of which come through on passage today. The common buzzard, but perhaps less frequently the rough-legged buzzard, which is a species of the high Arctic, may have come down in the winter when it was colder. Golden eagle. Golden eagle, apart from being a hunter, as you can see there, eating a fox, golden eagle is also a scavenger. Note, it's doing it in the snow. Golden eagles scavenge in the winter. When they're breeding and they have chicks, they will always kill. Why am I telling you that? Because this is information. The white-tailed eagle, powerful sea eagle, all these from Gorham's. The black vulture or cinereous vulture. The griffon vultures, there, get stuck in. And of course the bearded vulture, which is the bone breaker. This species only eats bones. This one comes in at the end of the carcass and takes the bones. Some people have shown that they will fly and drop them off onto anvils to break the bones. But as you can see in this picture, point blank looking down his gullet, it will eat the leg of a goat in one go. That was swallowed, did not require an anvil. And Neanderthal would have seen on this, and of course the migratory Egyptian vulture. They were all there, and the raven. Now, I'm speeding up. The evidence, well, the evidence is very clear when we look at the bones that Neanderthals were catching these raptors for the talons, for the feathers. The evidence is clear when you look at an electron microscope, the bones of these birds, you can see the cut marks made by the tools. I think that's quite clear there, of the Neanderthals. They were actually catching these scavengers, and I've suggested that maybe they were putting out the food to be able to attract them in. And we've done a lot of studies on this, so we're very, very clear on this. And this was quite a revelation. At first, people didn't realize this. Now, to continue showing you some gory pictures, one of the ways that we try to understand how this happened is, for example, the cut marks tended to be on the wing bones of these large birds of prey. So to isolate the fact that they're doing it for feathers and talons and not for food. The predominance was on the wing bones. Now, one of the things we have in Gibraltar is a lot of migration. A lot of birds cross the straits, and a lot of birds of prey fall and drown or die. And we're quick there, and we collect them or get them delivered to us, and we stick them in a fridge or freezer, because we can do things like this. We can dissect these things with stone tools, and then we say, right, if we're going to do this, how do we do this to end up with the cut marks on those bones, just like in the Neanderthal sites. Look at the wing bone of a soaring bird. It's lightweight. It's built for soaring. All it has is the bone, the humerus, you can see there, a tendon, and the insertion of the feather. There's no meat. So if you've got cut marks there, it's not because you're getting it for meat. It's for something else. You're getting it to extract the feathers. You can actually, sorry, if you're neat enough, you can bring it out in one piece. Anyway, and what we found was there's a particular range of species, the black vulture, lammergeier, raven, and so on, which are the core species that the Neanderthals are catching, golden eagle. Interestingly, there's some species that are less caught, like the black kite and the Egyptian vulture, and there's some that are not caught at all. The interesting thing is, remember I told you that golden eagles and white-tailed eagles come to carcasses in the winter. We found that black kites and Egyptian vultures, which come to carcasses, were hardly represented. But in the winter, they're in Africa. So this is a way of suggesting to us, from the different species and the knowledge of the species, that this practice of catching birds of prey may well have been happening predominantly in the winter. So hunters or scavengers, well, take your pick, but I want to show you something else. This is a picture from up on a ridge, and you can see the vultures soaring. Now, what do these vultures do? They travel huge areas of terrain. When one spots a carcass, it drops. The others are watching. These are watching each other. So the others drop. So if you're a hyena or a Neanderthal, watch the vultures and run, and you might get there. And I think that that association between scavengers and people probably goes back a long way. A maritime dimension, just to, I'm moving quickly now. One of the things we found with the Neanderthals is that they're not limiting themselves to terrestrial. They're catching things like monk seals, also dolphins, and we can talk about how they did it. And we saw cut marks, so they're butchering not just terrestrial animals, but there's a maritime dimension to the Neanderthals. They were catching a lot of shellfish, collecting shellfish from the shore. This is something you could do in a habitat like Gibraltar, which has the coast nearby. And of course, the shoreline is a very place rich for opportunities for scavenging. The tide twice a day brings in all sorts of things. There's a dead turtle up there, a dead bird here, and even a wild boar scavenging the landscape. So, and this is another one of the pictures from Murray St. John, where we have the Neanderthals scavenging on the beach, a monk seal. And look what's there. There's a cinereous vulture there, eating a tuna. There's an Egyptian vulture. There's a whole community of scavenging going on around here. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm speeding up. Surprises along the way. This is from a cave that we've been excavating now for the last few years, 2 or 3 years. And we've got dates now, again, going back to 100,000 years ago. And we found some very interesting things. There, in anatomical connection, this is before he was taken out and cleaned, was an intact eagle owl in association with Neanderthals. So there's all kinds of things going on in terms of this relationship that we need to understand and inform ourselves. But let me just summarize all this. I'm coming up to 7 o'clock with some images. One, if we look at trophic networks, one thing is clear. There is one network in which the prey inside the circle is rabbit, partridge, and smaller birds. Could be pigeons, corvids. And there's a whole suite of predators feeding on those outside Gorhams. You have lynx, you have the eagles, the goshawks, the foxes, and the Neanderthals. But these on the outside are obviously competing with each other for that prey. Let's look at the larger ones. Red deer, ibex as an example. That's got the wolves, the bears, the hyenas, the lions, the leopards, and the Neanderthals. But look, the Neanderthals are prey as well. Different system. And if we look at the scavenging, we have all kinds of scavengers and foragers on the coast. And in terms of the shellfish, perhaps the only competitors to the Neanderthals are some of the wading birds like whimbrel. but you've got hyenas, you've got the Neanderthals. So what all this says, to finish off, and I have timed it to perfection, what all this begins to tell us, and I hope that the pictures have helped to illustrate this, because we can put numbers, tables, graphs to support everything I've been telling you. But what this is telling us is that the lives of these Neanderthal people was more complex than perhaps we've ever realized. It's not the simple one of let's go out and hunt something. They're living complicated lives in a mosaic of environments which change through time, as we saw, seasonally or between years. So they had the ability to adapt. They knew where to go. Maybe when the seals were having the pups, they would go and hunt the seals. And the fact that you had this mosaic of habitats and species in a small area meant that they didn't really have to move very far. They could just, hunt this, gather this, do that or the other. And that was the successful part of the Neanderthal story. This is the part of the world where they survived longer than anywhere else. No doubt because of this, including the fact they had the coastline. But the story of the tooth of that little Neanderthal, or of Flint himself, tells us that, life wasn't always that easy. And perhaps living in the cave, having fire helped to some degree, but it was a tough existence. So I can think of no better way than to commemorate Flint, our little friend, than to talk about the world that he saw. So thank you very much. Thank you.